What if the most respectable soldiers of the Roman Empire were secretly performing rituals so bizarre, so physically extreme, and so psychologically twisted that even modern occultists would refuse to reenact them? Before you hear the first detail, ask yourself this. How far would a man go to prove absolute loyalty to a god who demanded secrecy, sacrifice, and submission in ways no other cult dared to imitate? The followers of Mithra were not simple worshippers. They were initiates of a hidden brotherhood whose ceremonies unfolded in darkness, beneath the earth, inside narrow stone chambers built to feel like the womb of the universe or the stomach of a beast ready to swallow them whole. These men believed Mithra watched everything, measured everything, and punished the weak without hesitation. To understand the absurdity of these secret rituals, you must picture the mindset of a Roman soldier kneeling inside a cold, torchlit Mithraeum, his armor removed, his identity stripped. Away, he faced rites that blended cosmic mythology with brutal physical trials. The cult was obsessed with symbolic death, forced vulnerability, and staged humiliation, using every ritual as a psychological test meant to break the ego before rebuilding it in Mithra's image. Imagine standing blindfolded while other initiates surrounded you with the sound of clashing metal, chanting invocations that blurred the line between devotion and domination. Imagine being told that every fear you had, every doubt you tried to hide would be exposed under the gaze of a divine judge who demanded absolute obedience. That atmosphere of suffocating secrecy turned ordinary men into vessels shaped by a hierarchy as rigid as military ranks, and as unforgiving as the myths carved into the stone walls around them. But the most unsettling part is how ordinary these men looked outside those chambers. On the surface, they were disciplined soldiers, merchants, administrators. Beneath the surface, they participated in rites that merged blood symbolism, animal sacrifice, forced isolation, and ritualized endurance. These ceremonies were crafted not just to honor Mithra, but to control the mind, train the body, and erase hesitation. And the deeper you go into their secret world, the stranger it becomes, because the absurdity wasn't accidental. It was engineered to separate the chosen from the unworthy. The question is whether anyone today would willingly survive even the first stage of what these men faced in total darkness. If this kind of hidden history forces you to rethink everything you thought you knew about ancient religions, leave a comment sharing your reaction, your curiosity, or even your suspicion about how many of these practices survived in symbolic form today. And before you continue, make sure you like this video and check whether you are already subscribed, because understanding these rituals in depth requires following the trail step by step. Now we move forward into even stranger territory, where the next revelation only intensifies the shadows cast by this first glimpse. As the darkness of the Mithraeum closes in, the next layer of the cult's secrecy begins to reveal itself. The ascension system that transformed ordinary recruits into silent instruments of Mithraic discipline. The followers of Mithra believed that enlightenment was not granted by worship, but earned through trials designed to expose every weakness a man tried to hide. These initiations were not symbolic gestures. They were physical ordeals, psychological confrontations, and moral tests engineered to push the boundaries of endurance. Each stage demanded absolute submission to a hierarchy that mirrored the Roman army, but operated with far more intensity, because the consequences of failure were spiritual rather than military. Imagine being a young initiate placed before 7 higher ranks of the cult, each representing a cosmic force and each authorized to judge your worthiness. You stood barefoot on cold stone, aware that the men watching you had endured humiliations, deprivations, and ordeals that only reinforced their authority. The rituals of initiation were deliberately disorienting. Blinding light from torches contrasted with passages of total darkness. Sudden bursts of noise interrupted long, suffocating silences. The intention was to dismantle rational thought, forcing the initiate to rely entirely on the cult's guidance. Every gesture, every whispered command, every symbolic phrase carved into the walls served as a reminder that the initiate's former identity was being stripped away with precision. Some rites demanded the initiate face staged confrontations meant to mimic death or capture. Others forced moments of forced stillness while senior members circled him, evaluating fear in the tension of his breathing. There were whispered chants in languages he barely understood, threats disguised as blessings, and symbolic acts that blurred the boundary between ritual and punishment. The purpose was simple but ruthless, to ensure that by the time an initiate advanced even a single rank, he had already surrendered his autonomy to the logic of Mithraic discipline. The cult's obsession with secrecy amplified the psychological strain. Initiates were forbidden to speak of anything they witnessed, even to fellow followers outside their own rank. This isolation deepened the mystique of the higher levels and fueled an atmosphere where doubt became a personal failure, not a natural response. In a world shaped by military order, the Mithraic initiation system offered something even harsher than the battlefield. It promised transformation, but only through submission, and only for those willing to endure the silent pressures that held the cult together. As these men climbed the hidden hierarchy, the rituals shifted from tests of endurance to demonstrations of obedience, each one drawing them deeper into a brotherhood, bound by shadows, secrecy, and an unbreakable loyalty to Mithra. Among all the obscure ceremonial acts hidden within Mithraic tradition, none provokes more fascination or disbelief today than the ritual often associated with the Tauroctony, a rite that merged symbolic rebirth with raw, visceral brutality. While scholars debate how directly the Mithraic version corresponded to the better documented Taurobolic rites of parallel cults, the essence remains the same, a ritual bathing in the blood of a slain bull to simulate purification through sacrifice. But in the Mithraic context, this act was not performed as a public spectacle. It was executed in the deepest, most secluded chamber of the Mithraeum, a place deliberately designed to overwhelm the senses and dissolve the boundary between myth and physical reality. Picture a narrow pit dug beneath a raised platform. Above it, a massive bull was restrained, its breath heavy and hot in the torchlight. The initiate descended into the pit, stripped of rank and identity, forced to confront the harsh reality that spiritual cleansing demanded physical exposure to death. Every sound in that chamber amplified the tension, the scraping of hooves against stone, the low rumble of anxious breathing, the whispered chants of the officiants preparing the sacrifice. When the blade finally cut through the bull's neck, the initiate experienced a torrent of warm blood cascading downward, saturating his skin, filling the small space with a suffocating mixture of steam, iron, and ritual symbolism. For the Mithraic mindset, this act represented a passage through cosmic darkness. The initiate was momentarily trapped between life and death, mirroring Mithra's own mythic confrontation with the primordial bull. Emerging from the pit meant emerging symbolically reborn, cleansed not by gentle purification, but by a confrontation with mortality so immediate that it blurred the line between transformation and trauma. To endure this moment without trembling was considered proof of readiness for deeper secrets, a sign that the initiate could withstand the psychological pressure of higher ranks. But the ritual's true power extended beyond its physical intensity. The secrecy surrounding it created an environment where the mind filled in what the eyes could not see. Initiates who had never witnessed the ceremony whispered their own imagined horrors. Those who had survived it spoke only in fragments, reinforcing the aura of forbidden knowledge. The chamber where it took place was often decorated with carved representations of Mithra slaying the cosmic bull, each image reminding the initiate that sacrifice was not an event, but a cosmic principle. In the Mithraic worldview, blood was not merely fluid. It was a symbolic bridge between chaos and order, between mortality and transcendence. This blending of physical ordeal and cosmic metaphor made the Tauroctony more than a ritual. It became an initiation into a worldview where suffering forged loyalty, where endurance measured faith, and where the boundary between myth and reality dissolved inside a dimly lit chamber beneath the earth. And for those who advanced further, the cult reserved trials that demanded not only strength, but an unshakable willingness to surrender the self completely. If the earlier rites broke the body and tested the nerves, the Mithraic system of 7 initiatory grades aimed at something far more invasive, the slow, deliberate dismantling of a man's identity. Each rank was not simply a title, but a psychological transformation, a reshaping of the initiate's inner world through oaths so demanding, so absolute, that no modern institution could enforce them without facing accusations of indoctrination. These vows were whispered in darkness, sealed by ritual gestures that bound the initiate to secrecy, obedience, and symbolic death. Within the Mithraeum, a man ceased to be an individual. He became a function within a cosmic hierarchy, a living symbol of his grade and its mythological burden. The hierarchy began with the Corax, the raven, a role that emphasized humility and silence. Initiates often performed menial tasks, serving food, carrying lamps, sweeping the floors of the stone chamber. This was not mere ritual labor. It was engineered submission, a reminder that spiritual ascent required erasing personal pride. The second rank, nymphs, imposed vows of temporary chastity and symbolic marriage to Mithra, a dramatic redirection of emotional loyalty designed to sever worldly attachments. By the time an initiate reached the rank of Miles, the soldier, he was expected not just to obey, but to accept orders without hesitation, mirroring the discipline of Rome, but framed as cosmic duty rather than military necessity. Higher grades demanded even more. The Leo underwent purification rites involving fire, smoke, and chanting, meant to strip away the remnants of hesitation. The Perses confronted rituals tied to ancient Persian cosmology, embodying Mithra's role as judge between darkness and light. The Heliodromus, or Sunrunner, experienced exhausting endurance trials that forced him to reenact the daily journey of the sun, a symbolic chase after divine purpose. And at the highest level stood the Pater, the Father, a rank reserved for men who had demonstrated absolute loyalty. His authority was not questioned, not because of rank alone, but because his ascension demonstrated that he had survived every stage of psychological pressure without breaking. But what made these oaths so devastating was not the content alone. It was the secrecy. Each rank revealed only what the next initiate was permitted to know. Men could spend years navigating a labyrinth of hidden expectations, ritual tasks, and moral tests without ever fully understanding the structure around them. This perpetual uncertainty reinforced the cult's control, ensuring that no follower could compare experiences or challenge the logic of the system. The higher one climbed, the deeper the silence became, until even the most loyal initiates sensed that there were truths buried so deeply within the Mithraeum that only a handful of men would ever face them directly. That tension between enlightenment and obedience became the mechanism by which Mithra shaped his disciples, drawing them further into a world where spiritual identity and personal autonomy were no longer separate concepts. If this transformation strikes you as disturbingly powerful, share your thoughts in the comments. What part of these hidden vows do you think had the strongest psychological grip on ancient initiates? Deep beneath the temples and military outposts where Mithra's followers gathered, the most unsettling rituals unfolded during the sacred banquets held in the Mithraic dining chambers. These gatherings were not simple meals. They were reenactments of mythical events designed to destabilize the initiate's sense of reality and impose a new spiritual identity through controlled fear, staged symbolism, and ritualized exposure to death. The banquet served as dramatized passages between the mortal world and the cosmic realm, inviting each participant to experience a form of symbolic dying before returning to the surface transformed, obedient, and psychologically tethered to the Brotherhood. The environment alone was enough to unsettle even seasoned soldiers. The chambers were deliberately cramped, illuminated only by flickering oil lamps that distorted the faces of the men seated along the stone benches. Shadows crawled across the walls, merging with the carved images of Mithra slaying the bull or guiding souls through celestial spheres. The sacred meal was arranged at the far end of the room, often placed beneath an arch meant to evoke the vault of the heavens. Every detail was engineered to dissolve the boundaries between mythic narrative and lived experience, creating a setting where the initiate felt suspended between worlds. During these banquets, initiates were required to witness dramatic reenactments of death that blended performance with genuine psychological intimidation. Senior members staged the symbolic slaying of a bull using carved props, darkened liquids, and ritual chants that grew progressively louder until they bordered on dissonant. The initiate was placed in a position of enforced stillness, unable to participate, forced to observe while the ritual unfolded like a cosmic judgment in which he had no voice. This passivity, imposed in a context of heightened intensity, induced a powerful sense of vulnerability, preparing him for the next stage of the ceremony. In some Mithraea, the ritual involved a sudden extinguishing of the lamps, plunging the chamber into absolute darkness. Only the sound of controlled breathing, shifting robes, or whispered invocations revealed that others were present. This moment simulated the descent into the underworld, a symbolic death meant to strip the initiate of his earthly identity. When the lights returned, they revealed senior members standing in altered positions, sometimes wearing masks symbolizing planetary guardians or celestial beings. The abrupt shift in orientation was designed to confuse the senses and force the initiate to recalibrate his understanding of the ritual space, reinforcing the idea that enlightenment required surrendering control. Food and drink served during the banquet carried symbolic weight rather than culinary purpose. The bread represented cosmic order, the The wine, the lifeblood of the slain bull, and the shared consumption of these items bound the group through a ritual contract deeper than verbal oaths. Every gesture, from passing the cup to breaking the bread, was executed with deliberate slowness, turning simple acts into layers of encoded meaning. The initiate's role was to witness, absorb, internalize, and ultimately conform. But the most psychologically potent aspect of these banquets was the unspoken tension that permeated them. The initiate never knew whether the ritual would end in symbolic revelation or an unexpected trial. This uncertainty cultivated a heightened state of awareness, making every breath, every flicker of torchlight, feel like an omen. Through these orchestrated experiences, the cult shaped men not through sermons, but through sensory manipulation, choreographed fear, and the promise that deeper secrets awaited only those who proved capable of navigating darkness without breaking. If the banquets trained the initiate to confront symbolic death, the next phase of Mithraic discipline forced him to confront something far more corrosive: the terror of constant observation. Among the most secretive elements of the cult was the practice centered around the so-called Eye of Mithra, a ritual system built on the belief that the god witnessed every hidden impulse, every forbidden thought, every moment of weakness that surfaced when a man believed himself unguarded. To enforce this worldview, the cult engineered a series of tests in which initiates were placed under unrelenting scrutiny, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, until their sense of private consciousness eroded into a perpetual awareness of being watched. These trials unfolded in Mithraea, constructed with narrow corridors, recessed alcoves, and strategically placed openings that allowed senior members to observe the behavior of lower ranks without ever revealing their presence. An initiate might think he was alone in prayer, or performing a simple task such as lighting lamps or arranging ritual objects, yet a hidden observer studied his movements, his posture, his hesitation. Any sign of doubt could become the basis for renewed testing. The initiate learned quickly that his thoughts, not just his actions, were subject to evaluation, and this began to shape a personality defined by vigilance rather than confidence. The ritual of perpetual watchfulness escalated into sensory deprivation exercises that pushed the mind toward exhaustion. The initiate could be placed in a dim chamber where the only sources of sound were dripping water or the faint scuff of movement beyond the walls. Forced to remain motionless, he could not determine whether he was being observed, judged, or forgotten entirely. Hours bled into each other without markers of time, eroding the boundary between waking thought and ritual-induced hallucination. It was during these periods that many initiates reported feeling the presence of Mithra more strongly than in any formal ceremony, not as a comforting guide, but as an omnipresent force pressing on the mind from every direction. At higher stages, the trials became more intense. Initiates were required to perform long vigils, maintaining focus while surrounded by symbols representing cosmic order, signs of the zodiac, planetary guardians, and engraved scenes of Mithra overseeing the universe. The pressure to remain alert was immense. Even a brief lapse, a momentary closing of the eyes or a shift in breathing could be interpreted as symbolic failure. The initiate learned that enlightenment, in the Mithraic worldview, did not emerge from relaxation or meditation, but from unbroken consciousness. The mind had to be sharpened by tension, not soothed by stillness. This ritual vigilance also served a social purpose. It created a hierarchy in which the lower ranks internalized obedience not through punishment, but through anticipation of judgment. Senior members rarely needed to correct initiates directly. The fear of disappointing the unseen watcher was enough to mold behavior. Over time, this constant pressure forged a psychological bond stronger than any spoken oath, binding men to a system where loyalty grew out of shared vulnerability rather than shared belief. The Eye of Mithra ritual revealed a truth more unsettling than the blood rites or endurance trials. The cult did not merely test the initiate's strength. It infiltrated his inner life, reshaped his instincts, and conditioned him to accept that the boundary between divine surveillance and human supervision no longer existed. With each vigil completed, the initiate stepped deeper into a worldview where secrecy, discipline, and spiritual anxiety formed the foundation of devotion, preparing him for trials that demanded not just alertness, but complete surrender of personal autonomy. Among the many trials that shaped the Mithraic path, few carried consequences as unforgiving as the ritual of the eternal flame. This ceremony, reserved for initiates who had already endured the pressures of vigilance and symbolic death, demanded more than endurance or obedience. It required an unbroken commitment to sustaining a sacred fire believed to embody the life force of Mithra himself. Failure was not interpreted as simple negligence. It was treated as spiritual collapse, a fracture of inner discipline that risked contaminating the entire brotherhood. The ritual, therefore, became one of the most feared and psychologically demanding rites in the Mithraic system. The eternal flame was housed in a recessed chamber where airflow was carefully controlled, and only a faint, shimmering glow illuminated the rough stone surfaces. The initiate chosen to guard the fire was required to remain beside it for long stretches, sometimes an entire night, sometimes much longer, never allowing the flame to waver, dim, or flicker beyond what the ritual permitted. The chamber's silence was nearly absolute, broken only by the crackle of burning oil or the slow, rhythmic breath of the man assigned to protect it. In this isolation, the initiate confronted fatigue, wandering thought, and the creeping anxiety that any small imperfection might doom the ritual. But the true challenge lay not in the physical task of maintaining the flame. It lay in the mental war waged against time, exhaustion, and the unbearable awareness of responsibility. The cult often intensified this strain by introducing sudden inspections. Senior members would enter without warning, observing the flame from the shadows while assessing the initiate's posture, alertness, and emotional control. A tremor in the hand, a lapse in concentration, even the suggestion of wavering discipline could result in penalties that symbolically reenacted the extinguishing of the fire. Ritual humiliation designed to reinforce the gravity of failure. Some Mithraea added further symbolic layers to this ordeal. The flame was treated as a miniature cosmos, and the initiate was expected to keep it alive as Mithra kept order in the heavens. If the flame flickered, it suggested cosmic instability. If it died, the implications were catastrophic. The initiate had betrayed the divine order and allowed darkness to intrude where discipline should have prevailed. Such symbolic weight amplified the psychological burden until many initiates found themselves fighting not only physical fatigue but also an oppressive sense of cosmic responsibility. The ritual's final stage often involved a transition from stillness to action. Once the period of guarding the flame ended, the initiate was required to carry a fragment of that fire into another chamber without letting the flame extinguish or spill. This movement through narrow corridors, while exhausted and mentally strained, reenacted the mythic journey of light moving through the darkness of the world. The slightest misstep could undo hours of effort. Those who succeeded advanced deeper into the cult's mysteries. Those who failed returned to lower duties, marked by quiet shame. The eternal flame ritual demonstrated more clearly than any other how the Mithric system relied on psychological fortification, symbolic pressure, and the manipulation of fear to shape devotion. It forged loyalty through hardship and transformed spiritual duty into an intimate struggle against one's own limitations, preparing the initiate for even more claustrophobic and disorienting rituals hidden deeper within the Mithraeum. If this ritual strikes you as one of the most intense tests of discipline in ancient religion, share your thoughts in the comments. Which part of this ordeal do you believe pushed initiates closest to breaking? The deeper one descended into a Mithraeum, the more the architecture itself became a ritual instrument. These hidden sanctuaries were not designed merely as meeting places. They were psychological. Chambers engineered to shape perception, behavior, and belief. The cult understood that the mind becomes pliable in confined spaces, and so they built their temples underground, in narrow corridors and low-vaulted rooms where the air was dense. The ceilings pressed downward, and every step felt like crossing a threshold into another world. For initiates unprepared for this architecture, the first descent into a true Mithraeum could induce a sense of shrinking, as if the outer world and its freedoms had already been stripped away before the ritual even began. Inside these dim sanctuaries, light was deliberately rationed. Oil lamps were placed to illuminate only what the cult wished the initiate to see, often a carved Tauroctony scene, or a symbolic arrangement of celestial signs, while leaving other areas swallowed in darkness. This selective lighting created a subtle claustrophobia, a sense that the walls moved closer with each breath. Even seasoned soldiers, used to the chaos of battle, found themselves disoriented by the oppressive silence. Every shuffle of a foot, every drop of moisture from the rough ceiling became amplified in the darkness, turning ordinary sounds into cues of unseen presence. These spaces functioned not merely as settings, but as tests. Initiates were sometimes instructed to navigate sections of the Mithraeum alone, relying only on touch and fragmented memory. The cold stone walls, the unexpected twists of the corridors, and the suffocating absence of natural air created a ritual journey where disorientation became part of the transformation. The cult believed that true spiritual insight could emerge only after a man's physical instincts failed him, forcing his mind to surrender to the symbolic order represented by Mithra. The architecture accomplished this without a word spoken, shaping the initiate's emotional state long before any formal rite began. Within certain Mithraea, chambers were constructed to intensify these sensations. Some were intentionally low-ceilinged, requiring the initiate to bow as he entered, an architectural command for humility. Others were circular or oval, designed to distort sound so that whispered chants seemed to come from all directions. In these rooms, senior members conducted rituals that involved slow, synchronized movements, often performed in near silence. The initiate, standing at the edge of the chamber, was forced to confront not just the cult's control over space, but its command over rhythm, breath, and emotional atmosphere. Another layering of psychological manipulation came from the knowledge that these temples were hidden beneath everyday Roman life. Above the Mithraeum, people walked freely, unaware of the spiritual trials unfolding in the darkness below. This secrecy reinforced the initiate's sense of separation from the outer world, deepening his reliance on the Brotherhood. Inside, the noise of distant footsteps or muffled voices filtered through the stone, creating moments where the initiate felt suspended between two realities, one mundane, one sacred, yet belonging fully to neither. But the most intense effect of these underground spaces was the way they erased the passage of time. Without sunlight, without external cues, initiates could not distinguish night from day. Rituals stretched into extended hours, and psychological fatigue merged with a sense of drifting between states of consciousness. This temporal dislocation served the purpose of the cult, to break down the worldly rhythms that shaped a man's identity and replace them with the timeless logic of Mithric symbolism. When an initiate finally emerged from the depths, blinking at the daylight, he carried with him not only the memory of the claustrophobic descent, but an unshakable impression that the world above was somehow less real than the shadows he had left behind. As the initiate adapted to the shadows, the Mithraic path led him toward rituals that blurred the line between symbolic sacrifice and psychological conditioning. These rites, often referred to by later observers as silent offerings, were not sacrifices in the literal sense, but carefully constructed performances designed to reshape the initiate's emotional responses, loyalties, and sense of self. At their core, these ceremonies revolved around the belief that silence itself was a form of devotion, one that revealed more about a man's discipline than any spoken vow could. In the Mithraic worldview, a follower's ability to endure symbolic loss without protest signaled not only spiritual maturity, but readiness for the final mysteries. In many Mithraea, initiates were required to participate in staged scenarios where objects representing aspects of the self, family, honor, strength, or worldly attachments, were placed on an altar and symbolically surrendered. The objects were often simple: a ring, a piece of cloth, a tool, a carved token representing a celestial sign. But their significance lay in what they represented to the initiate. When he placed the item before the altar, he was expected to do so without hesitation or emotional display, as though severing his attachment to whatever the symbol embodied. The senior members watched closely, interpreting the smallest tremor in the hand or shift in posture as a sign of impurity or unresolved conflict. The silence during these offerings was absolute. No chants, no torches crackling, no movement other than the initiate stepping forward. This absence of sound amplified the tension, heightening the psychological stakes. The initiate's thoughts became the loudest presence in the room, echoing within the confines of the Mithraeum until they felt inseparable from the ritual itself. This engineered silence forced him into direct confrontation with internal doubts, fears, and attachments. What he surrendered physically was trivial, but what he surrendered internally was precisely what the cult sought to test. Whether loyalty to Mithra now outweighed every bond formed outside the sanctuary. Another layer of manipulation came from the symbolic sacrifices performed by senior initiates during training rituals. These men, already conditioned by years of hierarchy and secrecy, acted out scenes of cosmic struggle or celestial judgment, where silence itself became a weapon. They displayed unwavering composure while relinquishing symbolic tokens representing pride, ambition, or personal identity. Their stoic performance served as both instruction and intimidation. Younger members understood that any emotional reaction, surprise, sorrow, or hesitation, might reveal a weakness that would be used against them in later trials. But the most unsettling element of these silent sacrifices was the way they created deliberate ambiguity. Initiates were never told whether the symbolic loss would be restored, transformed, or erased from the ritual record altogether. This uncertainty generated a sense of suspended, meaning where the ritual's purpose could only be interpreted by those who already held higher ranks. The initiate learned that understanding did not come through explanation but through endurance. The more he surrendered without resistance, the more deeply he was absorbed into the psychological architecture of the cult. These practices also served a strategic function for the Mithraic leadership. By observing how initiates responded to symbolic deprivation, they identified those capable of maintaining composure under pressure, men whose emotional discipline made them suitable for higher secrets and more demanding roles. In this way, the sacrifices were not offerings to a deity, but mechanisms of selection, filtering initiates based on their ability to internalize the cult's values without outward expression. Those who excelled were entrusted with increasingly confidential tasks. Those who faltered were quietly reassigned to lower duties, where their influence remained controlled. Through these rituals, the Mithraic order refined its followers into instruments shaped by restraint, silence, and controlled detachment, preparing them for the final and most extreme transformation that awaited at the culmination of their path, one that would demand not only symbolic surrender, but the full remolding of identity itself. At the end of the Mithraic path lay a ritual so intense, so carefully orchestrated, that it functioned as the final dividing line between those who merely followed the cult and those who were remade by it. This culminating rite, often described in fragmented sources as a form of symbolic rebirth, demanded absolute surrender of identity and an almost terrifying willingness to be reshaped by the mythic framework of the Brotherhood. The initiate who reached this stage was no longer tested through isolated trials of endurance or silence. Instead, he was immersed in a sequence of orchestrated experiences that merged darkness, disorientation, symbolic, death, and ritualized emergence into a new state of being. The ritual began with the initiate's descent into the deepest chamber of the Mithraeum, a space intentionally constructed to feel womb-like, tight, airless, and devoid of visual anchors. Senior members guided him through a series of motions meant to disorient him. Rotations in darkness, sudden bursts of light, the echo of footsteps circling around him, and brief glimpses of ritual symbols illuminated only long enough to confuse his sense of orientation. The most jarring moments came when the soundscape shifted abruptly from oppressive silence to rhythmic chanting that seemed to vibrate through the chamber's stone walls. The initiate felt suspended between dissolution and revelation, unable to gauge how much time had passed or what stage he occupied within the ritual. At the symbolic moment of death, the initiate was laid on a cold surface, sometimes a slab of stone, sometimes a ritual platform carved with the image of the bull slaying. A cloak was drawn over him, sealing him in darkness. He remained there until his mind drifted between fear, surrender, and a strange sense of expectancy shaped by the years of discipline that had led him to this point. Then, without warning, hands lifted him, guiding him upward into a chamber filled with dim light and a warmth engineered to feel like emergence from cosmic night into celestial dawn. In this moment, the initiate was told nothing. No doctrine was whispered, no explanation was offered. The rebirth was experiential, not intellectual. Its meaning lived in the disorientation, the vulnerability, and the profound psychological rupture that framed his emergence. The ceremony concluded with the placement of a garment, often white, sometimes patterned with celestial symbols, across the initiate's shoulders. This was not a reward, but a declaration. He had stepped into the final rank, not by understanding the cult, but by allowing the cult to reshape him. Whatever name he carried before, whatever loyalties once guided him, had been stripped away in the darkness. He now existed within the Mithraic order as a fully realized embodiment of its mysteries, bound not by instruction, but by transformation. And yet, even at this final stage, the ritual offered no clarity. It ended not with answers, but with a new threshold of uncertainty, urging the initiate to interpret meaning through lived tension rather than doctrine. That ambiguity was deliberate. It ensured that the power of the ritual extended far beyond the walls of the Mithraeum, shaping every future thought, instinct, and allegiance. The man who emerged from this final chamber was not simply elevated, he was rewritten, carrying a devotion forged through fear, endurance, secrecy, and the quiet gravity of symbolic death. If you reach this point and feel the weight of how extreme these ancient rituals truly were, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive into the hidden side of ancient religion. Leave a comment with the phrase, "I walked into the shadows," to mark that you followed this journey until the final moment, and give the video a like if the storytelling helped you see this forgotten world with new clarity. And when you're ready to keep exploring, there's another video waiting right beside this one that expands the story even further. Step into it and continue the descent.